Well, we had a sound check earlier, and it occurred to us that there is actually the Atlantic Ocean between you and I at this moment, and so the sound is coming in loud and clear as far as I can tell, but thanks to the wonders of modern technology, you're in the room with us, as well as the Atlantic Ocean being in the room with us right now.
Exactly.
Now, there's
It's
a
the
lot
third
going
wheel. It's the third wheel in the conversation, but we'll have to make do.
on. Exactly, exactly. Now, later in the conversation, we're going to get into the drama in the USA at the moment. There's a lot been going on in the last fortnight. No doubt you'll have some comments on that. And before we do that, though, you are an authoress. You have got an interest in the American Revolution, especially from a British perspective, especially from a Scottish perspective as well.
Mhm.
And so, just before we talk about your new book, can you just briefly tell us what made you become so interested in this period of American and British history?
Sure. I think that it really started when I was quite young. I took an interest towards British history in general. It started out with the myths and legends that are mostly settled around the Middle Ages, like Robin Hood, for example, which was the setting for my first novel, Saplings of Sherwood. And then as I grew a little bit older, but I was still in my childhood years, I did take an increased interest in the American Revolution because it was kind of a crossover point for the British history that I so loved and my own local history. I grew up in Maryland, so it's one of the 13 original colonies, but also with family across New York and New Jersey. So my dad would take me up to the bluffs of Fort Lee, which has a lot of American Revolution history involving Washington and Cornwallis essentially chasing each other around in their War of Wills and so forth. So there was a lot of material culture that fascinated me about the long 18th century, the time period. It was kind of an in-between time period, I viewed it as, because it sort of straddles, if you will, the time of the sort of the medieval period and the early modern, the Tudor era and stuff like that, the Stuarts, and then ultimately later on the sort of more fully modern period where you start getting photography and so forth. So it kind of was in between where there's still a sense of mystique due to the paintings, for example, the clothing, the general style. There's a sense of both distance and relatability. There's a closer relatability than the Middle Ages in the sense that we can actually read the writings of these people and they're speaking in basically modern English. Give or take, obviously, but you can feel that relatability with the primary sources. And for me, it just always was a fascination in terms of the British and I would say British American side of the story. So these were the Americans who still identified strongly as being British and they were loyal to the crown and so forth. And their stories tend to be forgotten. Their whole kind of cause and rationale was forgotten a lot of the time. And it just deeply fascinated me because I've always felt, have this deep attachment and affection for Britain as an American. And so I always identified sort of in sync that way. And I think that part of the interest actually was also just the mere fact that it was kind of a lost cause. And I know that some people think of like, oh, the lost cause romanticism that you get with sort of the Jacobite rebellions and stuff. But for me, I think it's a little bit deeper. I kind of lean into it because I think it is a very interesting sort of background, you might say, to ask important, deep spiritual questions for that matter. That how do you handle defeat in a worldly sense? How do you handle when everything is sort of stripped away from you, when you're under the most severe pressure, when it looks like everything is lost? It's almost a kind of a vibe you get in classic legends and myths when you think about King Arthur, the Battle of Camlan, and the separation of the Knights of the Round Table, the breaking of the Round Table, the destruction of Camelot. I feel like in its own way, the American Revolution contains those components, that you had a united Anglosphere, and you had a united empire, and it broke apart like the breaking apart of the Round Table in a way. And so when I went about trying to write it, I wrote it in that manner. I said, well, let's write it as if we're dealing with a kind of classical tragedy, and we'll bring to it all of those kind of perennial questions that come with the classical tragedy, and hopefully also just to call to mind the fact that we were one people, and in many ways I think that's forgotten. So for me, it's not. I've had some people say this to me where it's like, well, you've had to sort of take yourself out of yourself and put yourself into like another perspective. I'm like, it's not like that for me. It's no more like that for me, I feel, than if I were to say now, for example, that the Union and the Confederate sides of the American Civil War that happened later were not in some way equally of the same cultural heritage. That's how I feel about the British side, if you will. I feel like the Brits that we're talking about, these characters that have fascinated me since childhood, that I related to since childhood, are equally a part of my own heritage. They're not foreigners. They are part of our heritage. They are part of that fabric. They are, again, brethren, kith and kin, that kind of thing. So that's the way I approach it, as very much of a civil war.
Well, thank you for that answer, because that was an extremely eloquent and well put together, off the cuff explanation of what's driving you. And I like your idea there of how both sides are equally valid, because what tends to happen in politics, and especially in war, is that the defeated get vanquished and everybody forgets all about them. And your one's family goes on through time, and you come to accept that, oh, you were on the winning side, and weren't you great? And then you might look back into your history and you find, oh my goodness, like all our family were actually on the other side. I didn't know that. But society and time has made me just go along with the winning side. And so you're taking a very new, is nuanced the right word? Certainly nuanced, but a much more comprehensive and wider and a much more humane way of actually looking at things. And from a British perspective, I'm very glad that you're doing that, because you are raising out stories that we haven't heard before. And in that sense, that brings us on to your new book, which, how would you categorize it? It's called All Ye Who Pass By, and it's the book one, Gone for a Soldier. So it's what's the name for that genre, which is history but also fiction?
So it's historical fiction. Yes, historical fiction. And so it's the first book in a trilogy that deals primarily with the Saratoga campaign. So that was the turning point of the American Revolution. It was the campaign under General John Burgoyne. And it was the famous point at which the fortunes of war shifted, and the defeat of Burgoyne enabled, essentially, down the run of things, the revolutionaries to really gain support and the needed kind of backing from the European powers that kind of had it in for Great Britain from the previous wars, like the 7 Years' War / French Indian War, etc. So you have them ending up with the support of France, ultimately Spain, and ultimately the Netherlands. So Saratoga, it cannot be underestimated, like in terms of how important this was.
So this was 1777, just to put it in its time period, and the British wanted to draw a line between New England and the other restless colonies.
They wanted to cut. They
Why
wanted to
was that?
cut New
Why was
England
that?
off. Well, there was a
Sorry.
number of reasons for it. But primarily, New England was seen as the seat of the revolution, as the origin point of the Troubles. And it's quite interesting reading, for example, the speeches given by King George III, when he would actually say in one of his earlier speeches during this war, essentially, I thought that it was just, it was sort of a New England rising. That was what he was saying, that his counselors were essentially telling him. And he was saying, I thought it was sort of a localized thing, and you're telling me this thing has spread, it's metastasized. Well, that's a bit bad. Thank you, guys. You haven't exactly been keeping me up to date. And so, they definitely wanted to split the colonies in two. They thought that if they could do that, they could essentially cut off the head of the snake, and it would sort of, kind of writhe around a bit and then die. The trouble was, it was a very complex plan. It sounded good on paper, but it also was very complicated in terms of Murphy's Law and trying to get everything to converge the right way. There was a lot of just stuff that could go wrong, ranging from just the sheer distance that you're talking about, not just from Britain to the colonies, but also just getting from Canada down to Albany, and then for the other bodies to converge, the other, people like General Howe needing to follow up with the plan, and so many things could go wrong and did go wrong. It was a classic tragedy level mess, and that honestly makes for great Shakespearean storytelling. It's kind of delivered on a platter in that sense when it comes to wanting a dramatic story to tell. And most of the time, it does tend to be told from the side of the winners. Rarely do we get that kind of focus on, well, what would it be like to be a part of this thing that is just almost has folk horror elements, trekking through this dense New York State wilderness, and everything that entails. So it really was quite intense for the people involved, and it just got kind of progressively horrific for them, really. So I really tried to explore those themes in the story.
Yeah, because we forget about that, of course. It's like you read it from today and think, oh, how could they have done something like that? Oh, that was silly, or that was a bad move, or why didn't they do that or this? But I mean, you're talking about a wilderness, basically. There's no
Oh, yeah.
interstate highways that you can roll down. There's no Twitter that you can keep in touch via Messenger or whatever with each other. It's like literally
No.
The war, for many cases, would just be what the commanding officer thought was the best thing to do given the particular circumstances, not knowing what the commanding officers of the other battalions were necessarily doing today.
Oh,
And so
completely.
the whole thing was just really a game of chance at the end of the day, all these kind of battles back then. And so, I mean, the British lost the Battle of Saratoga, and you were saying that was a defining moment in the war, because their main aim to separate the problematic colonists up in Massachusetts and thereabouts failed at the Battle of Saratoga, which was
and they believed beyond just the fact that the rebellion had sort of festered in New England. They also were trying to split the colonies in half and get control of the Hudson River. So it came down to trying to secure supply routes and everything else. So it was more than just that it began up there, but that was part of it. There was multiple different reasons.
right.
But yeah, there was two battles of Saratoga, by the way. One was on September 19th, and the other one was on October 7th. But then they had like multiple different sort of semi-battles and skirmishes all the way up to that point on the campaign, such as the battle, or some call it kind of a large skirmish of Bennington and various others. But yeah, so the whole campaign tends to be sort of taken as a whole together. So there's not really a single battle.
Right.
But yeah, losing that was really what it was that the defining moment really was when the British line broke in the October 7th battle, and that
October 17th.
October 17 was when he surrendered. October 7th was when the battle took place.
All right. Right. Another October.
So it was 10 days. It was 10 days after the fact that Burgoyne eventually sort of called a convention after pulling a bluff in which he said very dramatically, as was his way, he was a playwright, and I relate to him immensely for that, where he was essentially like, you will either give us terms or we will raise the black flag and neither give nor receive quarter. And so he made a grand dramatic gesture there, and he tried to get the best terms he could, but that did not work out very well in the long term. But it's a long story.
Yeah,
it is.
There's that picture of that's the British general there on the left-hand side, trying to hand over his sword, but the American, being more of a gentleman, refused to take his sword off him, and we're told that he's gesturing there to the tent to welcome the British general to refreshments. So at least there was a bit of gentlemanly conduct on the battlefield afterwards.
There was, because, well, the interesting part of this was that General Gates, so this was General Horatio Gates, leading the, Revolutionary Army in this case, was himself a born Englishman. He was born in Malden, where the famous Battle of Malden against the Vikings took place. And he was kind of disgruntled, to put it mildly. He used to be a regular British army man. And then he got disgruntled. He felt like he wasn't getting the opportunities that he deserved. There's rumors and speculation that he was illegitimate, the son of a maid and an aristocrat, basically. And then he ultimately gets, from the wealthier side of the families, were paid off to go into the army. But he feels like he's not getting, his just desserts in what he thinks his genius is. So there's that. There's a number of other things. He ends up moving to the colonies, and he ends up on the revolutionary side of things. But he knew of Burgoyne and these other people. So, he'd been their comrades. You can make of that
Absolutely.
what you will in terms of whether he was a good or a bad person due to that, sort of the jumping of sides. But, I will say that I think, so the thing is, Benedict Arnold gets this specifically bad reputation, and for some good reasons. But at the same time, I think we need to remember that all of these people, to greater or lesser extents, if they're backing the revolution, especially if they'd been in the army in some context, they've taken an oath upon, the cross over the Bible here to the king. So they all are breaking solemn oaths. I think we should remember that to a certain extent, that it was treason, however one wants to define that, if one wants to justify the reasoning behind it, but it still was. And so all of these people were on some level committing just that. So there's that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you there. That's all been just kind of covered over, of course, with American folk history to an understandable extent.
Well, it's origin. It's origin myth, and it's the fact that, when we get down to it, at the time you had a third of approximately, not strictly so, but approximately a third of the colonists supported the revolution. A third were loyal to the crown. A third were neutral. So it was really just the fact that the one side won that we have this particular folk image of what it actually means to be an American, for example, and to kind of otherize the loyalists. But I feel like I should probably rope around here to General Simon Fraser, because it could be the endless saga down the other way.
That's the subject. Well, I'll just bring up a copy of your book here, All Ye That Pass By, Book 1, Gone for a Soldier. And am I correct in saying that Simon Fraser, Scotsman, is the center of your story here? And he's a real person that you've woven this tale around. So just briefly, before we start talking about the state of America, tell us about your book.
Sure. So, I'll talk about Fraser for a little while. So he is a major character within the trilogy. It becomes increasingly important as the story goes on. So basically, starting at the beginning, Simon Fraser of Balnain was born in Balnain in the Scottish Highlands. He comes from the Fraser clan, which during the Jacobite rebellions tended to waffle back and forth, was fairly famous for it. You have Simon Fraser of Lovat, called the Fox, and he is the clan chief, again, distinct from our Simon Fraser of Balnain. There was tons of Simon Frasers, warn you, like tons of them. but the clan chief famously zigzagged back and forth between politics and religion. So he went from Catholic to Protestant, Protestant to Catholic, and he went from Hanoverian to Jacobite, Jacobite to Hanoverian, back again. This was famous. He ultimately overplays his hand, gets his head chopped off for it. And you have a situation where at Culloden, the Frasers, some of them go out onto the field and meet their doom there, but some are withheld, some are held back. So clearly the Frasers were kind of hedging their bets and trying to figure out whether this thing was actually working out or not, even though they had said they were supporting Bonnie Prince Charlie at the time. And there's a legend about the scree of Culloden, this great black phantom bird. Some people to this day have claimed to see up in the Scottish Highlands. And, it's based on a lot of old Celtic mythology, based in like the Morrigan, etc., the goddess of death you get from the old myth. But basically, they claim that they saw it just before the battle, like the night before the battle. And some of the people who saw this said, "Oh, no, we're not going on this. We're going to step on out." And so they didn't participate in the battle. And others said, "Heck, if that's our destiny, we go into our doom." So anyway, obviously, Culloden was a complete catastrophe for the Jacobite rebels. And so the Frasers, because of their implications with all this, were brutally punished by the government, by the Hanoverian government, and many people fled the onslaught and the razing of their, properties and lands, and a lot of murder too, and left the country if they could get out. Such was the case of the teenage Simon Fraser of Balnain. So he ends up as an exile on the continent in the aftermath of the 45, and he winds up becoming a mercenary for the Dutch army. And this was something that had something of a history behind it. You had mercenary Scottish regiments fighting for the Dutch for a good long time.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one of the more famous characters in it, he could be a whole different episode, is Sir General Hugh Mackay, or Mackay, sometimes it's pronounced. And he was very famous during the Glorious Revolution. But he ended up, as you can see, the connection with William of Orange and so forth. So there was this Dutch crossover connection. So at any rate, our Simon Fraser ends up serving in the Dutch army as a Scottish mercenary for a good while, for about 8 years. But then you get the coming of the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, and eventually the British Army says, "Hey, we want to recruit Highland regiments, right? We are willing to give a pardon to former Jacobites who are willing to come back to Britain, take the oath of loyalty to the Hanoverian king," who at that point was King George II, "and go in as officers into the Highland regiments." So Simon Fraser does this. He goes back to Britain and he joins the Highland regiments. So during the French and Indian War, he sees service in North America. And he's involved in the Quebec campaign under General James Wolfe. And legend has it that he was the one. Now, this is somewhat, it's speculated because, as we've mentioned before, there are many Simon Frasers. So many Simon Frasers, it's very confusing. But legend could have been him. Is that when Wolfe's boat was passing by the French sentries on the river at night, they call out to them, and Simon gets up, and because he'd spent a great deal of time on the continent at this point, he became very fluent in multiple languages. He was kind of a linguist. By the end of it all, he seems to know English, Gaelic, French, German, and Dutch. So, and he's very good at imitating accents. So very good. So when he stands up, he basically is able to answer them back in French in perfect, like, again, you wouldn't think he wasn't a Frenchman kind of French. And so he manages to get their boat through. And then he goes on, they scale the heights of Abraham. He participates in the Battle of Quebec, and in which Wolfe loses his life at the height of his glory, etc. With regards to Wolfe, there's an interesting whole sort of plot with that as well, in the sense that he starts out being very negative about Highlanders. He has a lot of prejudices against them. When the first Highland regiments are formed, he basically says, they're no great mischief to us if they fall. He doesn't really, consider them to be he considers them to be kind of a cannon fodder asset, but not much more. He does not like Highlanders.
It's interesting that you say that, because that's the famous quote that we always hear from the Scottish nationalists, which is meant in some way to I'm not quite sure why, but to deprecate either Wolfe or the British Army or something.
Well, here's the fun part. I'll let you go. Yeah. There's a fun part to this, though.
We've just got a few minutes left, but
Lord. Basically, I'll keep going. So basically, what I was going to say is that the part that yes, the Scottish nationalists just drop off essentially is that Wolfe grows a great deal in his feelings toward the Highlanders, very much so, to the point where he's saying, no, they're like the most manly corps of officers I've ever seen. He's singing their praises by the end of this operation, and you've got the Highlanders saying, "I'll give you fire and water for the man." They literally bonded like in a super, super way. So it's all of that. But just to jump back to Fraser, yeah. So then he ends up, over the course of the years after that war, he serves in Europe in various contexts, and then eventually he marries a German woman. He ends up coming back to the British Isles, and he stakes out in Ireland, which was used kind of as a very much of a military stakeout ground at this time period, 18th century. And he ends up basically as the neighbor of General John Burgoyne, before he's a general back then. But anyway, he ends up next door to them. So he and his wife and Burgoyne and his wife are essentially next door to each other. So they become friends. They pick up each other's mail, and they get to know each other quite well, which will eventually have repercussions. So you end up down the line in the American Revolution, Saratoga campaign kicks in. Well, Burgoyne remembers Fraser, and he says, nobody respects you as much as I do. And there really is something rather lovely about that, in the sense that Fraser had to overcome a lot. There was a lot of still prejudice against Highlanders, and originally Highlanders were only really supposed to, especially those who'd served in the, they were associated with Jacobite clans, right? So essentially, the situation was that they were only supposed to be in command of other Highlanders. They're not supposed to be commanding other people from other places. But Fraser, he can't be kept in his place. He rises. He is commanding people of every stripe. He's commanding all Britons at this point. So he ends up on the top tier at the Saratoga campaign. You have General Burgoyne, you have General Fraser, and you have General William Phillips, who was the artillery. So you had Fraser in charge of the light infantry and Phillips in charge of the artillery. So he, in some ways, is Burgoyne's hitman to a certain extent, as the advance guard, as the light infantry, doing all of these things. He participates in a number of the early battles and skirmishes, and he's always out in the front, always fighting. They call him a host in one man and the soul of the army. He literally captures the kind of adoration and respect of the entire army. And he's, considered just this extremely, extremely dynamic man, and who cannot be kept in his place, who rises above all opposition. Ultimately, what happens to him is that when you get to the actual battle points, well, you have a situation where Burgoyne decides Britons never retreat. We're not going to back off even when things are going to hell in a handbasket. This is a disaster. And, it just gets to become more and more and more of a disaster as the campaign devolves. Fraser knows this. He's against the final assault that is made, the last Battle of Saratoga. He's opposed to it. He thinks it's a bad idea. But he's going to, of course, take orders, and he's going to go out there and give it his all, even though he thinks it's a disaster and Johnny's losing his marbles. So out there on the field, he very famously rides around breakneck speed. He's practically the only man, well, really, he is the only man, holding this line together. He's riding back and forth, swinging his sword wherever the line is breaking. He's there in front of them, encouraging them, trying to hold the line together. And then he realizes, or should I say one of his aides realizes, they say to him, "General, you are being inordinately targeted." So it means when the inordinate versus ordinate thing goes on, what simple information is that back in this time period, you weren't supposed to really inordinately specify knocking out the general in that super specified man in a tree way. It was considered uncouth and ungentlemanly, especially if your opposition general like hired effectively an assassin to do it to you. So this is what they would say when they say inordinate targeting. So he's told you are being inordinately targeted. It's not just random lead flying around. And Fraser very famously says back when they say, "Why don't you get down?" And he says, "No, this line will break. I can." And then they say again, "At least, back up, for heaven's sakes. Get off your horse or back up." And he very famously says, "My duty forbids it." And then continues to ride back and forth. Eventually, he is shot and mortally wounded. The poor man ends up being taken off of the field and taken to the women's quarters, where they think he will be safest. But it's just a really heart-rending scene for someone who's so dynamic and so, larger than life, to be reduced to being laid out on a table. So he's put on a table. He's been shot in such a way that he's sort of effectively been partially disemboweled because it's torn up his, internal organs so badly. It's just terrible stuff. So even though he had such a reputation for courage all the way up to this point, he cannot restrain his groans and his screams, which is so hard for him. And he goes on this cycle of being unable to control his screams and groans, and then apologizing to the women and the children and saying, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I'm so sorry that he fears he's frightening the children. He's frightening the women." The poor guy is just a mess. So, and then he famously, again, very famously says, when he's in the midst of all of this, the famous lines, "Oh, fatal ambition, poor General Burgoyne, my poor wife," which is so sad. But also really, again, emotional in the sense that he's thinking of Burgoyne in the midst of all this. Like, this guy is sent him to his doom. And so he died.
I'm sure.
So
I'm sure if he was, I'm sure if he was lying with his guts hanging out and screaming, he would be scaring the children. But I suppose
he was
back
scaring
then,
the children. Yes,
the children were made of stronger stuff, perhaps, than they were.
Yeah,
Listen, Avellina, it's the top of the hour, so we're just going to have to.
So he dies. He dies. At the end of it is that he dies tragically the next morning, and he's buried out on that hill with that thing. And there's a lengthy funeral that goes on, and it gets cannonaded, and it was all very dramatic. But he's buried there to this day, somewhere out at Saratoga. So that is the story of General Fraser. And if you want to read more, you can read it in this book.
Well, hold your book up. Hold your book up.
I'll hold it again.
That's the point of this. That's your book, All That Passed By, historical fiction, but very true to life, but with some added flavor, by Avellina Balestri. And all you need to do is go to Amazon.com or Amazon.co.uk and type in "All Ye That Pass By," and that in itself will get you the book. And I've just been told that somebody has already bought it. Somebody that's been watching has already bought it. Now let's just look at some of the comments that we've got here as you were speaking. Neil says, "The inability to conceptualize the enemy as honorable rivals, only as enemies of humanity, is one of the ailments of the time." That's Sean Neil Erner who says that. Quite right. TC says, "This is a great chat tonight." Ian, your friend, is in, who says, "How do you handle defeat? How do you handle defeat? Good question for the Nats." TC says, "I have walked the Freedom Trail in Boston and the state of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Boston founded in 1630. So yes, one or two comments. Everybody loving your. JD says, "I'm loving this. Thanks, Avellina." It's great. It's great to hear an American who understands American history for a start. And it's unusual to find an American who understands American history, but also understands it from the British perspective as well, from a sympathetic angle. That's very unusual, actually, when you think about it, especially that. And of course, what's Paul saying? Paul says, "Family legend myth has it that we, Paul Hadlow's family, are related to General Wolfe on my mother's side." It wouldn't surprise me, Paul. The patriotism continues on down to you. Oksana says, "This is really interesting." Absolutely. Absolutely interesting. And TC says, please have this lady back on again at some point. She's brilliantly interesting, isn't she just?
Thank you.
Absolutely. And we could fill in, I've got the feeling, a 2-hour program with you, Avellina, because
we could do a jumbo program on redcoats. We really could. There's so many interesting ones. I mean, just on Scots alone, we could fill up, kind of like a mega program or something and sell it on your Amazon store. But really, there's just so many interesting figures.
Well, let's do that. I mean, a jumbo program on redcoats. That's the. I'm writing that. I'm writing that down. That's what we're going to call it. A jumbo prog on redcoats.
I think we could have actually an awesome amount of fun with that.
we absolutely could. An awesome amount of time. And also it occurred to me that Simon Fraser is, of course, the name of the Earl of Lovett, who fought as a British commando in World War II. He was quite famous for his...
And he was a descendant of the Fox as well. So they went down that line because the Fox's son eventually, also named Simon Fraser, so confusing, eventually got reinstated. So, you ended up with a situation where the line reconnected and you get the ongoing Fraser story in British history.
Right. Okay, so we'll call that to an end. Let me just remind folk, you are the author, Avellina Balestri, of All Ye That Pass By, which can be found on Amazon. And your YouTube is youtube.com/@ Avellina Balestri, AVELLINA BALESTRI. Avellina, you've been great company tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving up your time.
Well. Oh, it was lovely speaking again. It's really enjoy it. And I love your banner in the background as well. That is awesome.
Absolutely. Well, we're trying to have a different flag each week for whatever is happening that day or around that day in British history. And today, of course, it was the abdication of Mary Queen of Scots and the James VI coming to her son, James VI coming to be the King of Scotland, which in the fullness of time made him the King of Great Britain. So yeah, auspicious day, as they say. Okay, Avellina. Yeah, we'll definitely do this again. And we'll definitely have this jumbo program on redcoats because there's so much to learn. I mean, tonight I just learned there about, I didn't know, I knew the Wolfe's famous comment that the Scottish Nats don't like, but I didn't know that he came to change that comment around and came to appreciate.
No one ever does. They get stuck on that. Yeah, they get stuck on that and they never check to see, hey, did that evolve and anything? Oh, it's just because they want there to be discord. They don't want anyone to ever heal from the wounds of civil war. They kind of thrive on it. So it's up to us to fix that. Yeah.
It's a good point. It's a good point. People will find the truth at the fringes by reading your books and by watching and listening to A Force for Good. Okay, Avellina, let's do this again. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. God bless. You have a great day.
God bless you too.